Thanks for joining me again for the second half of this awesome topic that, again, I've told you is very near and dear to my heart. And that's looking at parental shame, social reactions, and the acceptance of deafness, a social psychological perspective on parent experiences. And this is the second half of this, looking at the research and giving it a bit of a critique. So let's first start talking about what did the studies do well? There was quite a few things that I found actually that were quite well within these studies. Both studies, or all six studies were a mix of qualitative and quantitative data and research, right? So these types of studies provide an understanding of parent perspectives using both the data, are quantitative, and interviews are qualitative. The topic's very relevant. Deaf studies has been happening for as long as there has been deaf people on this planet, I would want to argue. Parental well-being and impact of diagnosis on families, the stigma, the support that they require, and the access to information is being explored. And this is so important because I would argue that this is, for as long as deafness has been studied, these have been topics that have been studied as well that are ever evolving. So it's super relevant. What was really interesting was that there was actually some sibling dyads happening where we were able to compare parenting styles for two different children with the same parent. And then we were also able to see, them in the same environment. We were able to have compare the parents' level of stress, their type of parenting. So that was really great. We looked at bilingualism, which if you know me, you know that's really important in a lot of my research is looking at making sure deaf kids have all options for communication so that they can strive. And Sarkowski and Bryce did a really great job in that when they did their study, 7 out of 11 parents had reported that their children were bilingual and communicated depending on which communication partner they had. So that was nice to see because we don't often see those in a lot of deaf education studies. And there was some deficit lens removed. Zarkowski and Bryce again, they really focused on the positive psychology framework. And I would also say Ofari, Sanzo, and Pottinger, they really talked about parents supporting each other. That out of all of those hundreds of data points that they were looking at with interactions with families in this Facebook group, there was only 5 negative comments. So I think the studies really did a good job on all of those things. But there obviously, and with all research, there are limits. And within these studies, what I found, some of the limits were things like the smaller sample sizes and the types. Sarkowski and Price, they only had 8 participants. So again, it's kind of small. Park and Yoon, they looked at 5 Korean mothers. So does 5 people really represent the whole population? Probably not. Celia, they had 34 parents that they had for a sibling comparison. But again, I don't know that it's quite enough. Um, when we look at Ofari and Sanzo and Pottinger, and when they were talking about the social media, that one was a little bit hard because we don't really know who was responding. Like we know that group was designed for parents of deaf and hard of hearing kids, but was it always parents that were responding? Or even asking the questions? It's hard to say. Um, we saw a lot more mothers than fathers in these studies. And this has been something that I've noticed a lot through a lot of research is that it's often the moms. But again, we kind of come back to that social norm of who is responsible for child rearing. And it's usually the moms that get that prize and are all of the kind of expectations related to child rearing fall on the moms. And so it's often the moms that are dealing with the deaf child more exclusively or extensively. Um, Looking at some of our other studies, they did have 80 plus participants, which is great, but we were also very niched in those groups. They were oral, a lot of oral focused, a lot of hearing parents. So we were missing some of those, maybe the sign language kids. Would that have changed some of the parenting? Here we go again. The parenting stress, would it have changed that? And I wonder again if different areas of the world would have had more to offer. So we looked at, Iran and we looked at Korea, which we know there is a lot of shame associated with having deaf children. But then I wondered if we would have similar levels of parental stress, like parent stress and child language delays and behaviors and all of those things. If we were looking at like a Scandinavian country, like for example, Sweden, where there's huge emphasis and push for children to be bilingual and all of the supports that are provided to them, would the results be the same? Self-reporting. I wonder, are parents being really honest? When are they kind of going to that social norm? Are they answering how they think they want the researcher to how they want the researcher wants them to respond because they're afraid of social stigma and being looked down on as a bad parent. And in fact, in the Seeley study, the parents were reported feeling judged when they were asked about their parenting styles. So you got to wonder, even that little bit of having like an online, again with that Seeley study where it was all online interviews compared with in person. As an in-person person, maybe you get a bit of a relationship with the people, you'll feel more comfortable sharing. Um, One thing that's kind of, again, that I talked a bit about here is like, we looked at Korea and Iran, and that is a bit of a deficit in that the studies are limited to particular cultural groups. But I also would argue that knowing some of that is important for researchers, particularly researchers in other countries where maybe that's not such a problem or a stigma. And also, when you think of social implications in the future, we could be using some of that information for like newcomer families when they come to a country where there is support for deaf and hard of hearing children to kind of bridge that gap and tell them like that stigma doesn't exist here. Like it might actually be a little bit helpful. Some of the gaps that I've identified in the research, and again, this is something that's super common across the literature, is the deaf and hard of hearing perspective is often limited. Seeley et al., they excluded 10 parents because they were either deaf or they had two deaf children. Quittner and et al., they excluded 7 parents because they identified as being deaf or hard of hearing. So the deaf and hard of hearing perspective is missing. The family systems are ignored. I'm wondering again, we talked a lot about moms, but do dads feel the same way? Do grandmas and grandpas feel the same way? How do the extended families feel? How do siblings feel? Like that could be a whole new area of research we could be looking at longitudinal research. We took this information from very specific cross-sectional often approach. And so it was very specific as to when we were getting that data. And I'd be really curious if these feelings of stress and stigma stay the same. Do they improve? Do they worsen? I'd be curious to know if we did this interview when the child was first diagnosed and 5 years diagnosis and 10 years post-diagnosis and even 20 years post-diagnosis, does that stress remain the same? Um, the levels of hearing loss, again, we talked about kids that have cochlear implants. So cochlear implants, you have to have at least a severe to profound hearing loss to qualify for that. So we know that communication becomes a huge problem because we're not necessarily hearing the language that's being spoken. So does the hearing level hearing level loss change the results? If we had more of a mild or a moderate loss, would the parenting stress be the same? Would it be less? That stuff I'd want to know about. And there is so much focus on oral deaf children. And I'm really wondering if these findings of the stress and the stigma carry over to bilingual deaf children. It's a question I've been asking for a long time. Yeah, I've been asking it for a long time. So going on to our next thing, my own personal reaction. So when my own child was diagnosed 17 years ago, I remember sitting down with a mom and asking her what I should do and where I should go next. And I was telling her my struggles of not having enough information from the medical professionals. And she said and her children were 25. And she said, nothing's changed in 25 years. We're doing the same thing. We're fighting about if we should have sign language. We're fighting if they should have cochlear implants. It's the same thing. And I think now, 17 years later, I'm a teacher of the deaf and hard of hearing. I have been for the last 8 years. And I work a lot with families coming into my programs, but also just families when they're first diagnosed. Nothing's really changed. It's been very, very small changes over the years. Medical professionals continue to use old research. Um, Parents are often seen as observers more than decision makers. You shall use oral language only. I recommend you get a cochlear implant because of this. Um, and so when you're, as a parent, not really able to explore your child's hearing loss and you're being given a lot of information, it's really hard to accept that diagnosis, and make decisions that are in the best interest of not only your child, but you. So I know that when I can empower parents, that really results in having empowered kids. So, my approach when I, as a teacher of the deaf, meet families, I give them everything. I give them all of the options about communication. I really stress to them that the only thing your child will not be able to do is hear the same as you or I. That's the only thing. That's the only thing. What you need to focus on is loving your child and giving them communication and helping them with school and being able to just connect with them. Um, and I think that also has really helped me as a teacher of the deaf and hard of hearing is that when parents do come in and they're mistrustful of the education system and they're feeling overwhelmed, to know that I am a parent too who has had very, very similar experiences, they're so much more willing to connect with me and share their experiences and just talk a little bit more about how we can help their kids. And I think that we really do need to shift away from that whole idea of deficit thinking. Oh, my poor deaf child. I cannot tell you how many times I have been approached in public by someone asking me if they can pray over my child or if they see me and my son signing with each other, stopping me and going, did you know that there's those cochlear things you can get in their head and you wouldn't need that sign language? So just getting away from that deficit perspective and really hoping that society as a whole becomes a little bit more educated about deafness. Social implications, right? What does all this research tell us? What is it going to mean for social psychology and the world? Parental support and empowerment is so key. Parents need unbiased and balanced information. They need a voice in the decision making and they need ongoing emotional and informational support. I'm not just talking about birth and diagnosis and then off you go. I'm talking about throughout this child's life, through all those big milestones going to starting elementary school, transitioning to high school, post-secondary, world of work. There are so many times and so many unknowns that parents just need support with, and we need to be looking at how we can provide that. It's important because we know that the research shows stigma and lack of support contributes to lower acceptance of the child's deafness. So if we are able to provide good parental support and empowerment, that's going to change a lot of the game. When we're talking also about family and social support, we need to be looking at supporting parents and siblings. If there's one takeaway I took, and again, I've been doing this for 17 years with twins, and it was reading this research where I thought I had to step back and go, I haven't really thought a lot about the hearing sibling of my deaf child and how his deafness has impacted him. So I think having parental support, that also falls down onto siblings would be really, really, really important. In terms of healthcare and education, we need to be using current and evidence-based research. We need to be hiring qualified professionals to provide a training and support to families and the deaf child. We need to move away from that deficit thinking. We need representation of deaf individuals. Imagine being at a hospital being told your child is deaf or hard of hearing and seeing a deaf nurse or a deaf doctor. They exist. It's hard for them to get into school. It's hard for them to get jobs because there's still so much stigma, but they're there. And imagine if we could show parents right off the hop, look at these successful deaf individuals. Your child can do the same thing, how that would change things. I think it's really important for us to know about stigmas from other countries and address them so that when we have newcomers here in Canada who have been given a diagnosis for their child, that they know that they are safe and they are loved and supported here in Canada, and that we do not see this as a punishment from God or any of the other pieces that may be coming from their own cultural implications and stigmas. We need to have language development and support, constantly looking at how a kid is doing and shifting the focus and giving them everything they need to be successful. This is important because, again, when parents know that they have support, they're more likely to accept their child's hearing loss, and then their child's going to do better academically, socially, and emotionally. Early intervention and language access. Again, early access to language, spoken and signed. Again, I'm going to say it, spoken and signed. They need both. Let children have everything until we know what works best for them. Let parents have a voice. Be doing often language assessments and providing that support early on. Have support groups. And we need to support the child and their family. We need to include deaf adults at the table. Often, for many families, the first time they've met a deaf person is when they've met their own child. And so, including deaf adults in part of early intervention is going to be so important for families so that they can see that their deaf child can be successful and do so many things. I'm going to conclude by talking about just the broader social impact that these studies have really helped to identify. And the key is honestly reducing stigma surrounding deafness. Governments really should explore and look at models used in Scandinavia. There are huge financial supports in place in many Scandinavian countries for families of deaf children. There are state-funded, regulated schools that are centered on accessibility and inclusion. In Sweden, they actually have a law that protects sign language rights for deaf and hard of hearing children. Those children are considered bilingual at birth, and they get state-funded, mandated early intervention that includes the family. And Norway has a whole protection of linguistic rights of deaf children. We need to recognize sign language as a language of instruction and as an official language. We do have it in Canada at the federal level, American Sign Language, LSQ, which is the French Sign Language, and Indigenous Sign Language are recognized as a language of instruction and a language for deaf individuals. And at the federal level, you can walk into a building and get a sign language interpreter, but that's at the federal level. If I walk into a provincial government building, I don't get those same things. So it would be nice to see it federal, provincial, and civil. Um, Public education needs to happen in regards to deafness. People need to just see that deafness is normal. Let's normalize deaf identity and let's have a representation of deaf voices for all policies related to healthcare, education, everything. There's a common phrase in the deaf community about nothing about us without us, and decisions should not be made about deaf and hard of hearing individuals without them at the table. Support our entire families, include those siblings, because it does take a village. Um, I will conclude by saying the research shows that negative social reactions impact parental acceptance and well-being. If we're able to support parents through accurate information and reducing stigma at a societal level, it is going to be essential in promoting well-being and positive outcomes for deaf and hard of hearing children. Thanks for coming to my TED Talk.